the new god of information, the new gods of information, the new god of information, the new goddess of information, the new goddesses of information, the new goddess of information, the old god of information, the old gods of information, the old god of information, the old goddess of information, the old goddesses of information, the old goddess of information, the greater god of information, the greater gods of information, the greater god of information, the greater goddess of information, the greater goddesses of information, the greater goddess of information, the lesser god of information, the lesser gods of information, the lesser god of information, the lesser goddess of information, the lesser goddesses of information, the lesser goddess of information, the higher god of information, the higher gods of information, the higher god of information, the higher goddess of information, the higher goddesses of information, the higher goddess of information, the lower god of information, the lower gods of information, the lower god of information, the lower goddess of information, the lower goddesses of information, the lower goddess of information, the greater spirit of information, the greater spirits of information, the greater spirit of information, the lesser spirit of information, the lesser spirits of information, the lesser spirit of information, the higher spirit of information, the higher spirits of information, the higher spirit of information, the lower spirit of information, the lower spirits of information, the lower spirit of information, the major god of information, the major gods of information, the major god of information, the major goddess of information, the major goddesses of information, the major goddess of information, the minor god of information, the minor gods of information, the minor god of information, the minor goddess of information, the minor goddesses of information, the minor goddess of information, the superior god of information, the superior gods of information, the superior god of information, the superior goddess of information, the superior goddesses of information, the superior goddess of information, the inferior god of information, the inferior gods of information, the inferior god of information, the inferior goddess of information, the inferior goddesses of information, the inferior goddess of information, the ancestor god of information, the ancestor gods of information, the ancestor god of information, the ancestor goddess of information, the ancestor goddesses of information, the ancestor goddess of information, the ascendant god of information, the ascendant gods of information, the ascendant god of information, the ascendant goddess of information, the ascendant goddesses of information, the ascendant goddess of information, the descendant god of information, the descendant gods of information, the descendant god of information, the descendant goddess of information, the descendant goddesses of information, the descendant goddess of information, the transcendent god of information, the transcendent gods of information, the transcendent god of information, the transcendent goddess of information, the transcendent goddesses of information, the transcendent goddess of information, the past god of information, the past gods of information, the past god of information, the past goddess of information, the past goddesses of information, the past goddess of information, the present god of information, the present gods of information, the present god of information, the present goddess of information, the present goddesses of information, the present goddess of information, the future god of information, the future gods of information, the future god of information, the future goddess of information, the future goddesses of information, the future goddess of information, the authentic god of information, the authentic gods of information, the authentic god of information, the authentic goddess of information, the authentic goddesses of information, the authentic goddess of information, the synthetic god of information, the synthetic gods of information, the synthetic god of information, the synthetic goddess of information, the synthetic goddesses of information, the synthetic goddess of information, the progressive god of information, The progressive gods of information. The progressive god of information. The progressive goddess of information. The progressive goddesses of information. The progressive goddess of information. The regressive god of information. The regressive gods of information. The regressive god of information. The regressive goddess of information. The regressive goddesses of information. The regressive goddess of information. The ordinary god of information. The ordinary gods of information. The ordinary god of information. The ordinary goddess of information. The ordinary goddesses of information. The ordinary goddess of information. The extraordinary god of information. The extraordinary gods of information. The extraordinary god of information. The extraordinary goddess of information. The extraordinary goddesses of information. The extraordinary goddess of information. The static god of information. The static gods of information. The static god of information. The static goddess of information. The static goddesses of information. The static goddess of information. The dynamic god of information. The dynamic gods of information. The dynamic god of information. The dynamic goddess of information. The dynamic goddesses of information. The dynamic goddess of information. The land god of information. The land gods of information. The land god of information. The land goddess of information. The land goddesses of information. The land goddess of information. The sea god of information. The sea gods of information. The sea god of information. The sea goddess of information. The sea goddesses of information. The sea goddess of information. The sky god of information. The sky gods of information. The sky god of information. The sky goddess of information. The sky goddesses of information. The sky goddess of information. The god of information. The gods of information. The god of information. The goddess of information. The goddesses of information. The goddess of information. The half god of information. The half gods of information. The half god of information. The half goddess of information. The half goddesses of information. The half goddess of information. The vessel of information. The vessels of information. The vessel of information. The name of information. The names of information. The name of information. The person of information. The persons of information. The person of information. The persona of information. The personas of information. The persona of information. The personage of information. The personages of information. The personage of information. The personality of information. The personalities of information. The personality of information. The personification of information. The personifications of information. The personification of information. The image of information. The images of information. The image of information. The imagination of information. The imaginations of information. The imagination of information. The belief of information. The beliefs of information. The belief of information. The thought of information. The thoughts of information. The thought of information. The word of information. The words of information. The word of information. The action of information. The actions of information. The action of information. The reaction of information. The reactions of information. The reaction of information. The feeling of information. The feelings of information. The feeling of information. The situation of information. The situations of information. The situation of information. The circumstance of information. The circumstances of information. The circumstance of information. The environment of information. The environments of information. The environment of information. The relationship of information. The relationships of information. The relationship of information. The number of information. The numbers of information. The number of information. The formula of information. The formulas of information. The formula of information. The equation of information. The equations of information. The equation of information. The theory of information. The theories of information. The theory of information. The symbol of information. The symbols of information. The symbol of information. the color of information, the colors of information, the color of information, the thing of information, the things of information, the thing of information, the way of information, the ways of information, the way of information, the place of information, the places of information, the place of information, the time of information, the times of information, the time of information, the event of information, the events of information, the event of information, the result of information, the results of information, the result of information, the crown of information, the crowns of information, the crown of information, the throne of information, the thrones of information, the throne of information, the information king, the information kings, the information kingdom, the information kingdoms, the information king's subject, the information king's subjects, the information king's dominion, the information king's dominions, the kingdom of information, the kingdoms of information, the kingdom of information, the information queen, the information queens, the information queendom, the information queendoms, the information queen's subject, the information queen's subjects, the information queen's dominion, the information queen's dominions, the queendom of information, the queendoms of information, the queendom of information, the information prince, the information princes, the information princedom, the information princedoms, the information prince's subject, the information prince's subjects, the information prince's dominion, the information prince's dominions, the princedom of information, the princedoms of information, the princedom of information, the information princess, the information princesses, the information princessdom, the information princessdoms, the information princess's subject, the information princess's subjects, the information princess's dominion, the information princess's dominions, the princessdom of information, the princessdoms of information, the princessdom of information, the lord of information, the lords of information, the lord of information, the lordess of information, the lordesses of information, the lordess of information, the priest of information, the priests of information, the priest of information, the priestess of information, the priestesses of information, the priestess of information, the ritual of information, the rituals of information, the ritual of information, the shrine of information, the shrines of information, the shrine of information, the temple of information, the temples of information, the temple of information, the leader of information, the leaders of information, the leader of information, the follower of information, the followers of information, the follower of information, the natural substance of information, the natural substances of information, the natural substance of information, the supernatural substance of information, the supernatural substances of information, the supernatural substance of information, the temporal substance of information, the temporal substances of information, the temporal substance of information, the spiritual substance of information, the spiritual substances of information, the spiritual substance of information, the natural form of information, the natural forms of information, the natural form of information, the supernatural form of information, the supernatural forms of information, the supernatural form of information, the temporal form of information, the temporal forms of information, the temporal form of information, the spiritual form of information, the spiritual forms of information, the spiritual form of information, the age of information, the ages of information, the age of information, the era of information, the eras of information, the era of information, the awakener of information, the awakeners of information, the awakener of information, the awakening of information, the awakenings of information, the awakening of information, the realm of information, the realms of information, the realm of information, the dimension of information, the dimensions of information, the dimension of information, the zone of information, the zones of information, the zone of information, the frequency of information, the frequencies of information, the frequency of information, the century of information, the centuries of information, the century of information, the millennium of information, the millenniums of information, the millennium of information, the purpose of information, the purposes of information, the purpose of information, the meaning of information, the meanings of information, the meaning of information, the culture of information, the cultures of information, the culture of information, the demonstrator of information, the demonstrators of information, the demonstrator of information, the demonstration of information, the demonstrations of information, the demonstration of information, the manifester of information, the manifestors of information, the manifester of information, the manifestation of information, the manifestations of information, the manifestation of information, the presence of information, the presences of information, the presence of information, the glow of information, the glows of information, the glow of information, the goal of information, the goals of information, the goal of information, the plan of information, the plans of information, the plan of information, the book of information, the books of information, the book of information, the philosopher of information, the philosophers of information, the philosopher of information, the philosophy of information, the philosophies of information, the philosophy of information, the releaser of information, the releasers of information, the releaser of information, the release of information, the releases of information, the release of information, the variable of information, the variables of information, the variable of information, the cause of information, the causes of information, the cause of information, the effect of information, the effects of information, the effect of information, the journey of information, the journeys of information, the journey of information, the emergence of information, the emergences of information, the emergence of information, the source of information, the sources of information, the source of information, the originator of information, the originators of information, the originator of information, the origin of information, the origins of information, the origin of information, the forefather of information, the forefathers of information, the forefather of information, the foremother of information, the foremothers of information, the foremother of information, the ancestor of information, the ancestors of information, the ancestor of information, the descendant of information, the descendants of information, the descendant of information, the lineage of information, the lineages of information, the lineage of information, the heritage of information, the heritages of information, the heritage of information, the heir of information, the heirs of information, the heir of information, the co-heir of information, the co-heirs of information, the co-heir of information, the joint heir of information, the joint heirs of information, the joint heir of information, the dynasty of information, the dynasties of information, the dynasty of information, the force of information, the forces of information, the force of information, the law of information, the laws of information, the law of information, the pact of information, the pacts of information, the pact of information, the game of information, the games of information, the game of information, the mask of information, the masks of information, the mask of information, the armor of information, the armors of information, the armor of information, the sword of information, the swords of information, the sword of information, the shield of information, the shields of information, the shield of information, the force shield of information, the force shields of information, the force shield of information, the armored force shield of information, the armored force shields of information, the armored force shield of information, the champion of information, the champions of information, the champion of information, the guardian of information, the guardians of information, the guardian of information, the defender of information, the defenders of information, the defender of information, the protector of information, the protectors of information, the protector of information, the chant of information, the chants of information, the chant of information, the shape of information, the shapes of information, the shape of information, the cube of information, the cubes of information, the cube of information, the cuboid of information, the cuboids of information, the cuboid of information, the sphere of information, the spheres of information, the sphere of information, the spheroid of information, the spheroids of information, the spheroid of information, the prism of information, the prisms of information, the prism of information, the pyramid of information, the pyramids of information, the pyramid of information, the cylinder of information, the cylinders of information, the cylinder of information, the cone of information, the cones of information, the cone of information, the triangle of information, the triangles of information, the triangle of information, the circle of information, the circles of information, the circle of information, the semicircle of information, the semicircles of information, the semicircle of information, the square of information, the squares of information, the square of information, the rectangle of information, the rectangles of information, the rectangle of information, the parallelogram of information, the parallelograms of information, the parallelogram of information, the rhombus of information, the rhombuses of information, the rhombus of information, the trapezoid of information, the trapezoids of information, the trapezoid of information, the polygon of information, the polygons of information, the polygon of information, the pentagon of information, the pentagons of information, the pentagon of information, the hexagon of information, the hexagons of information, the hexagon of information, the septagon of information, the septagons of information, the septagon of information, the octagon of information, the octagons of information, the octagon of information, the nonagon of information, the nonagons of information, the nonagon of information, the decagon of information, the decagons of information, the decagon of information, the evolution of information, the evolutions of information, the evolution of information, the revolution of information, the revolutions of information, the revolution of information, the elemental art of information, the elemental arts of information, the elemental art of information, the elemental science of information, the elemental sciences of information, the elemental science of information, the elemental principle of information, the elemental principles of information, the elemental principle of information, the elemental technology of information, the elemental technologies of information, the elemental technology of information, the low elemental art of information, the low elemental arts of information, the low elemental art of information, the low elemental science of information, the low elemental sciences of information, the low elemental science of information, the low elemental principle of information, the low elemental principles of information, the low elemental principle of information, the low elemental technology of information, the low elemental technologies of information, the low elemental technology of information, the high elemental art of information, the high elemental arts of information, the high elemental art of information, the high elemental science of information, the high elemental sciences of information, the high elemental science of information, the high elemental principle of information, the high elemental principles of information, the high elemental principle of information, the high elemental technology of information, the high elemental technologies of information, the high elemental technology of information, the agent of information, the agents of information, the agent of information, the agency of information, the agencies of information, the agency of information, the amplifier of information, the amplifiers of information, the amplifier of information, the amplification of information, the amplifications of information, the amplification of information, the enhancer of information, the enhancers of information, the enhancer of information, the enhancement of information, the enhancements of information, the enhancement of information, the magnifier of information, the magnifiers of information, the magnifier of information, the magnification of information, the magnifications of information, the magnification of information, the influencer of information, the influencers of information, the influencer of information, the influence of information, the influences of information, the influence of information, the emanator of information, the emanators of information, the emanator of information, the emanation of information, the emanations of information, the emanation of information, the converger of information, the convergers of information, the converger of information, the convergence of information, the convergences of information, the convergence of information, the aura of information, the auras of information, the aura of information, the impression of information, the impressions of information, the impression of information, the intelligence of information, the intelligences of information, the intelligence of information, the sophistication of information, the sophistications of information, the sophistication of information, the genius of information, the geniuses of information, the genius of information, the polymath of information, the polymaths of information, the polymath of information, the psychic of information, the psychics of information, the psychic of information, the knowledge of information, the knowledges of information, the knowledge of information, the understanding of information, the understandings of information, the understanding of information, the wisdom of information, the wisdoms of information, the wisdom of information, the secret of information, the secrets of information, the secret of information, the mystery of information, the mysteries of information, the mystery of information, the revelation of information, the revelations of information, the revelation of information, the tactic of information, the tactics of information, the tactic of information, the strategy of information, the strategies of information, the strategy of information, the strength of information, the strengths of information, the strength of information, the might of information, the mights of information, the might of information, the power of information, the powers of information, the power of information, the authority of information, the authorities of information, the authority of information, the dominion of information, the dominions of information, the dominion of information, the rhythm of information, the rhythms of information, the rhythm of information, the melody of information, the melodies of information, the melody of information, the music of information, the musics of information, the music of information, the lyric of information, the lyrics of information, the lyric of information, the song of information, the songs of information, the song of information, the dance of information, the dances of information, the dance of information, the spirit of information, the spirits of information, the spirit of information, the soul of information, the souls of information, the soul of information, the body of information, the bodies of information, the body of information, the mark of information, the marks of information, the mark of information, the promise of information, the promises of information, the promise of information, the visionary of information, the visionaries of information, the visionary of information, the vision of information, the visions of information, the vision of information, the picture of information, the pictures of information, the picture of information, the sound of information, the sounds of information, the sound of information, the dung of information, the dungs of information, the dung of information, the language of information, the languages of information, the language of information, the communication of information, the communications of information, the communication of information, the people of information, the peoples of information, the people of information, The society of information. The societies of information. The society of information. The fortress of information. The fortresses of information. The fortress of information. The government of information. The governments of information. The government of information. The city of information. The cities of information. The city of information. The nation of information. The nations of information. The nation of information. The civilization of information. The civilizations of information. The civilization of information. The world of information. The worlds of information. The world of information.